Like I said in notes number 1, we have 5 congruent statements that helps us prove that 2 triangles are congruent. And in these set of notes, we're going to learn what the last 3 of them are going to be. The first one is angle side angle, so ASA, and that tells us that if we have 2 angles and the included side, and remember the included side means it's between. So in this case, it's between the 2 angles. And if we have that they are congruent to 2 angles and the included side in another triangle, then the 2 triangles are going to be congruent to each other. So at angle side angle, you can see in my example that angle A is congruent to angle D, and side AC, so my 1 mark right here, is congruent to side DF. And lastly, my angle C with the 2 marks is congruent to my angle F. And because of that, we have A, B, C is going to be congruent. That would have to be D is congruent to A, so it has to go first. And we know that C is congruent to F, so that has to go last. So it would be triangle D, E, F. The second of the 3 ways is proving that triangles are congruent by angle side. That's our AAS, and that's where we also have 2 angles, but the side is a non-included side. This means, since it's non-included, that it's not between the 2 angles that we have in our triangle. And if we have that they are congruent to 2 corresponding angles and the corresponding non-included side of another triangle, then the 2 triangles are congruent to each other. So if you look at our picture, we have angle A right here is congruent to angle D, and we have angle C, which is our 2 lines, is congruent to our angle F. So notice we got 2 angles, but look where the side is located. The side is not between the 2 angles, it's off to the side. So my BC is congruent to my FE. And if I name it A to B to C, I have to have my D first. F has to be last, so I have to go this direction. So angle D, E, F. The third of the ways is, and lastly of all 5, is proving the triangles are congruent by HL. So notice that there's only 2 letters here, and that means hypotenuse leg. And you have to think, when do we have a hypotenuse? And that's only when we have a right triangle. So if the hypotenuse and a leg of a right triangle are congruent to the hypotenuse and a leg of a second triangle, then our 2 triangles are going to be congruent. So if we look at our picture, if both triangles are right triangles, which we can tell by our angle right here, so in a sense they already have another angle that is congruent, and we see that BC is congruent to EF, which is a leg, or that's a leg, not the hypotenuse, and our hypotenuse, which is AB, is congruent to our hypotenuse of ED, then our 2 triangles are congruent. So you've got triangle A to B to C, so we need to go the same order, so my side of 2 and then 1, so it'd be D, E, F. We need to prove that the 2 triangles are congruent, and now we've got all 5 ways that we can use. In these first 2 triangles, we can see that we have 2 angles and 1 side. Our side is not between the 2 angles, which means in our acronyms up here, we need one that has 2 A's, so that'd be one of these first 2, but our S, our side, cannot be between them, so that means it has to be our angle side. Just like before, we need to write the congruent statement. So if we write RPT, I want you to fill in what does the order of the other part need to be for our second triangle. R is congruent to D, so that has to go first. My P is congruent to C, so that has to go second, and then the remaining letter is E. Number 2, I put this one on here for a couple reasons. It's a circle, which we don't know much about circles yet, but we do know that there are vertical angles formed right there. And if you remember in a circle, if M is the center of a circle, these lines are all called the radii, or it's the radius of the circle. And the radius of the circle should all be the same, so that means we actually have congruent segments. So now if you look at it, we have two sides that are congruent, and we have one angle that's between the two sides. So if we need two S's, and we need an A to go with it, but the angle has to be between the two sides, so it has to be side, angle, side. For our congruent statement, if we write SRM, the second setup has to be in the same order. So we know that our M has to be last because those are congruent to each other. And it doesn't really matter about the other ones because if you think about it, if this is an isosceles triangle, we know that our opposite angles are going to be congruent to each other. So if we have two sets that are congruent, it really doesn't make a difference of what letter goes next in our congruent statement because they are going to be the same. So if I put Q first and then my P, that would be okay. For number 3, again, we have our side that's reflexive in the center. We have two sides and one angle, but it is a right angle. So as soon as you see the right angle, you want to think of, could it be HL? And we need a leg and we need a hypotenuse. We do have a hypotenuse and we do have a leg. So we can say that these two triangles are congruent by HL. Because we don't have any letters, we don't have to worry about a congruent statement on this one. For number 4, I want you to write down if these two are congruent to each other and the reason if it is possible. You should have noticed by now that you've got a third side here in the middle that are going to be congruent because they're reflexive, and because of that, you've got 3 sides that are congruent, so this should be congruent by side, side, side. We are continuing on with the same type of questions, it just didn't all fit on the same page. So on number 5, again, we have congruent vertical angles in the center, but all we have is one set of angles and one side. And this is not enough information, so this is going to be neither, since it's none of the 5 that we have options of. Number 6, again, we have vertical angles in the center here. I also see it's a right angle, but the right angle doesn't help me unless I've got 2 sides in my triangle, so I have hypotenuse and a leg. So first you always want to check, is it HL? In this case, it's not because we don't have another side, but we do have 2 angles that would be congruent because our right angle would also be congruent to itself. And we have one side that's between those 2 angles. Because our angles, we got 2 angles and our side is between the 2 angles, we've got angle, side, angle. And again, we don't have any letters in this one, so we don't have to write a congruent statement. Number 7, I would like you to do this one by yourself. Again, you've got vertical angles, so don't forget about that. So hopefully you notice that that's also going to be 90 degrees, so you have 2 sides that are congruent and one set of angles that are congruent. Our angle is between the 2 sides, so we've got side, angle, side. And number 8, for the millionth time it seems like, we've got a reflexive side in the middle that are the same because this is a linear pair and we've got a right angle. We know this one will also be a right angle, so we've got one angle and 2 sides, but the angle is not between the 2 sides, so we can't do side, angle, side. But we do see a right angle, so you want to check to see, could it be HL? And it is because we have a hypotenuse and we have a leg that are congruent. This one does have letters, so let's go ahead and do our congruent statement. So if we do KMJ, so the one on the left is KMJ, would be congruent to triangle. Let's see, our M would have to be the middle letter because those are the right angles. My K and my K will be congruent, and then my L will be the next one. 9 and 10, we want to figure out what is missing so that we can prove that they're congruent by angle, side, angle. So remember, we need 2 angles, and the side has to be between the 2 angles. Remember, you also want to write down in your picture what is congruent. So our angle E is congruent to angle N. We have angle F is congruent to angle O. So we have 2 angles, but we need a side that's between the 2 angles. This tells us that since the side has to be between the 2 angles, EF would have to be congruent to NO. Part of number 10 you're going to do by yourself. So first I'll help you mark up the picture. RVS, so our angle right here, is congruent to TVS. this angle, and remember the side in the middle is congruent. So think of what you have that is missing, what you need to make sure that they are congruent by angle, side, angle, and go ahead and answer that one. Remember, we have one side and one angle, but we need an angle so that the side is between the two angles. So if I put the angle right here for my angle T, this side is not between T and V, so I cannot do angle T. If I do angle S right here, now my side is between the two angles, so that's the one that I want. And so this is what we need to say is congruent, but notice we can't just say angle S, we do need to use 3 letters. So my S will be my middle one. I have to use my R and V then for the other angles. So that's for the top one, so RSV. The bottom one then would be TSV. So that's what we need to make sure that they are congruent by angle, side, angle. For 11 and 12, we want to show that our two triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. I put my reminder off to the side that we need 2 angles and one side that's not between the 2 angles, so it needs to be off to the side. On number 11, if we mark up our picture, we have B is congruent to Y, and A is congruent to X. We have 2 angles, so we are missing a side. And not only do we just need a side, but we need a side that's not between the 2 angles. So since AB and XY would be the side that's between it, I just cannot use that one. So I actually have 2 choices. I could either use segment AC is congruent to XZ, or I could say that BC is congruent to YZ. That either of those would work because in both situations it would make it where it's angle, angle, side. On number 12, when we've got our picture with all the markings, if EF is congruent to NO, we have 1 angle and 1 side. So I want you to figure out what you have that is missing. Since we have 1 side and 1 angle, that means we are missing an angle, and the angle has to be placed so that it is not creating the side between the 2 angles. So I cannot do letter E and N because then my side is between it, and that would be angle, side, angle. So I have to choose D and M. On these last few, we need to prove that it is congruent by HL, so hypotenuse, leg. But remember, it needs to be a right triangle, and then you have a hypotenuse, and one of the legs that will be congruent to each other. 13, we say that J is a right angle and J and D are congruent. So that must mean that angle D is also a right angle. So we've got the right triangle. RM is congruent to FB, and so that means we've got a right triangle when we have the hypotenuse that is congruent to each other. To show that they are congruent by HL, I need a leg that will be congruent to each other. So I'm going to use JM and DB. Just like on number 11, there were really 2 choices you could put because there are different legs we could use. So I want you to fill in what the other possibility is for the other leg that we could say that would be congruent. You should have chosen RJ congruent to FD, since that's the other leg that could be congruent. At number 14, we can see that we have a side that's congruent because they're reflexive, and that gives us a leg, and we see the right triangle. I want you to fill in what we need to show that they are congruent by HL. What we need is the hypotenuse. And that would mean we need these 2 to be congruent. So WX would have to be congruent to KV. At number 15, we can see the congruent statement, and I want you just to complete the statement down below. So if we have KLJ, what I did just now is I numbered my first triangle as 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, because that means that my 1s are paired up together, my 2s are paired up together, and my 3s are paired up together. So first they put the K first, then they put the L, and then the J. So I need to place the other letters in the exact same order. So I need to put my Z first, then my X. Sorry, that's my 1, not a J. And then I need to put my W would be last. On this next one, I want you to do this yourself, so fill in what needs to be congruent if my two triangles are congruent to each other. You should notice that this is the second and third letter, so you need to pair up the second and third letters. So it should be PN is congruent to EF.